Thank you. My parents met on July 20th, 1969. It was the day that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. They were on horseback on a mountaintop in a small archipelago in the North Atlantic called the Faroe Islands. It was kind of romantic. They were immediately taken with each other, and they ended up spending a fair bit of time together. See, my mother lived there. She'd grown up there. My father was there on vacation visiting his mother's family. My grandmother had also grown up there, but had met a sailor during the war and had eventually got married and moved to Canada, where my father was raised. The Faroes is a small, isolated place, and it's pretty much the only reason anyone would have visited at that point was that they had some kind of relative because their parents had escaped. They got along great. My dad came home, and then they continued to write to each other. And a couple months later, my dad got a letter saying that my mom was pregnant. My dad was a pretty honorable guy, so he sent a letter back asking her to marry him and included a plane ticket. And my mom accepted both of them. And next thing you know, she was over here. And less than a year after Neil Armstrong took that one giant leap for mankind, I was born. This is how I came to grow up in two different places, two very different places. And this had a profound effect on my life. See, growing up in Toronto was, kind of good in a geopolitical sense, but kind of sucked in a little kid sense. I was small, I was gangly, and I was kind of weird. And I didn't have a lot of friends. I had a couple, but there was far more kids waiting for me after school to beat the shit out of me. And that sucks. But when I'd go to the Faroes, and we went there fairly often, at least every other year, and we even lived there for a couple of years when I was a kid. When I went there, there was no social class amongst the children. Kids just played. They went outside and they played. Because really there was nothing else to do. The place was very isolated, and they didn't have a lot of modern conveniences that we were used to. So this kind of created a balance in my life. But even better than being a normal kid there, I was extra special because I was from a different place, and nobody there, or very few people there, had experienced life outside of the islands. And the kids wanted to know what it was like to be in Canada, and I would tell them magical tales about wondrous things they could only imagine, like television. And having more than one movie theater in town. And not only that, each of those movie theaters had more than one movie theater inside them. And these stories just amazed them. And so it gave my life a certain balance, as I mentioned, and it made things tolerable. I don't know what my life would have been like here if I hadn't had that. And it made things better. When I was about 14, I went to visit, and I always stayed with my cousin, Hans Peter. He was about a year older than me, and we were like best of friends, and we always got along fabulously. But at that time, his parents had moved, and they no longer lived in the main city of Tórshavn, which was, a huge town of about 10,000 people. And instead they lived in this small town called Laner. And Laner it's beautiful. It's really, really stunning. There's only about 200 homes, at least certainly no more than that. And it's on this little bay where a mountain river empties into the ocean. And there's one of the few places in the Faroes that actually has a sand beach. Even with more isolation, we still had a fabulous time. We'd climb the mountain, or we'd go and swim in the pools under the waterfall. It was perfect for a kid. And at nighttime, we'd go down to the beach and we'd gather up all the garbage that had washed up on shore, and we'd build a campfire. And we'd hang out and talk and desperately try to impress the local girls. Because when you're 14, it doesn't matter where you grow up. There's some things that are universal, pretty much universal amongst teenage boys, and that was our interest in girls. And it hit me pretty hard when I was 14. I was fascinated with girls. I didn't even understand it. I didn't know why I was so attracted to them, but I just desperately wanted to kiss somebody. And I have to admit it, I was totally taken with their breasts. I didn't know why, but they just looked so much fun, and I wanted to know what they felt like. But being in Canada, of course, that sucked, because there was no chance in hell that I was going to get any girl to even talk to me, let alone be my girlfriend. But in the Faroes, it occurred to me that I might actually have a chance. And this gave me some hope. And sometimes hope is a wonderful thing. One night we were down on the beach, and Hans Peter and I decided that we were going to go and get some more garbage for the fire. And we were out wandering along the beach, and I found an aerosol can, an empty aerosol can. Now, I'd been told as a kid, don't ever put an aerosol can in the fire, because when you heat it, it's under pressure, and when you heat it, that pressure increases until eventually it explodes. The problem is that explosions are one of those other things on the list of things that teenage boys universally like. And I was kind of a smart ass, and I thought, well, it's empty, so that should give us at least 30 seconds to run away. I don't know where I came up with that number. I mean, totally, I actually pulled it out of my ass, but it was wrong. I don't know if my friends knew this or not, but they decided that they were going to take a head start and go down to the other end of the beach. And on Spater night, stoked the fire and got it nice and hot, and then cleared a space in the middle of it, and we tossed it in and we ran as fast as we could. We got to the other end of the beach, and we waited. And nothing happened. But we were pent up with nervous energy, so we started to talk and this nervous chatter. We wanted to know what was going on. How come it hasn't exploded? How long is this going to take? Is it going to explode at all? What are we going to do if it doesn't explode? Can't we go back to the fire? It's kind of getting cold out here. And eventually those minutes started to stretch out, and as the minutes stretched out, the nervousness subsided and the chatter started to die down and turn into just ordinary teenage conversations about the important things in life, like music and movies. And then, just as we'd forgotten about the can, we heard the loudest sound we'd ever heard in our lives. And we turned just in time to see this gigantic cloud of embers float out and up into the sky. And without anyone saying a word, everyone turned and immediately ran towards the fire. I got 10 paces, and I saw another aerosol can lying in the sand, and I thought, cool, we're going to do this again. And I reached down and I picked this thing up, and I turned it over and I looked at it, and I thought, that's odd, because the underside of the can had been violently ripped open as if something explosive had happened to it. And it was around that moment that I noticed the pain in my hand. This thing that had been sitting in the fire for 15 minutes, it was hot. And I dropped it, or at least I tried to, because it was stuck. And I was shaking it violently, and about the third shake it came off. Sorry, that's about as gross as it gets. It finally came off, and I turned and ran in the opposite direction from all my friends and my cousin, and headed for the mountain stream, and plunged my hand into the icy cold waters, and I sat there for about 2 hours like that. Doesn't help you to pick up chicks when you're sitting next to a cold river and everybody else is hanging out by the fire, but it saved my hand. I had terrible, terrible burns on every finger, but not a single scar to this day. But it was at least a week before I could tie my own shoes. Something like that can ruin a summer for a kid, but not in the Faroes, because the place is a magical place for kids. There's nothing to worry about, really, except for the trouble that the kids can get into themselves. And eventually, I wasn't even thinking about it. Within 2 days, we were still climbing on the rocks next to the river or swimming in the pools under the waterfall, having a fabulous time. And eventually, I actually met a girl that was as interested in me as I was in her. And we ended up climbing into the rocks next to the waterfall where we were alone. And I got to kiss a girl for the first time in my life. And as we made out, I slowly slid my hand up her shirt, and I touched her breast for the first time in my life. And to this day, I will never forget the searing pain that ran through my hand. But it didn't stop me. Thanks for listening to my story. I'm Zeb Pike.